Okay, thank you. Well, very, very warm welcome to everyone who's joined us this afternoon. My name is Marika Contellis, and I'm sitting here on Gadigal Wongal land and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'm actually sitting in at the University of Technology Sydney in a room working off my iPhone, and isn't technology awesome? This session will be recorded. You would have had that little information up on your screen, and we record it to share the rich conversations that we've been having across the 16 days of activism. I am particularly excited about this session. We are the sporting nation, as we like to call ourselves. Australia and Australians are defined in many instances by their love of sport and all the activities that come in and around sport. We have an awesome lineup this afternoon who will share their own views and experiences around redrawing the lines, gender violence, abuse and harassment in sport, but also really turn their mind through conversation around, well, what are the solutions? How do we make sport safer, fairer and more inclusive? We absolutely encourage you to use the chat function and to interact with the speakers. The way we'll structure it today is we'll have our awesome panel talk for a few moments and then kick off into a panel discussion. So without talking too much, I would like to welcome David Sharp, who is the CEO of Sport Integrity Australia. If you don't know David, David has a very rich history in the sporting context. He's got a rich history in working in different sectors, including in policing, but he is certainly going to share what Sport Integrity Australia is all about and some of his views. Welcome, David.
Thanks, Marika, and thank you for an invite today to participate in an incredible panel, and welcome to my panellists, and thank you for accepting me as part of the panel. I think what's really important is this topic today, and the fact that we're addressing it, we're raising it openly, but also I think it's important the role that sport plays in this space can't be understated, and the power of sport. Such a big part of our culture, and it is a powerful vehicle to influence social change. Sport Integrity Australia was established just on 18 months ago in response to what's called the Wood Review, looking at integrity threats in Australia to sport. And in our first 12 months, we were set up to coordinate a response for sports. Our goal certainly was to ensure a safe place for everyone in sport. And I think, to be honest, if we get it right, working in a partnership, and we all have a role to play, we can use the platform of sport to make change, particularly around violence and abuse. In playing that coordinating role in the first 12 months, what impacted us dramatically was Athlete A and gymnastics, and the groundswell of claims of abuse and people demanding action. The Human Rights Commission and Gymnastics Australia joined together to address those issues. It was a first response of its kind. And on the back of that, we realised that we needed it and had a role to play in sport. So in our first year, we changed dramatically from what our intent was. And we realised on the back of the gymnastics review, there certainly was a need for independence in managing complaints in sport. As a result, government sponsored us or supported us to deliver not only the anti-doping role and other roles that we have, but to deliver a couple of key bodies of work for sport in the country. One of them was a National Integrity Framework, which is a streamlined suite of policies for sport, particularly addressing member protection and child protection issues, bullying, abuse, intimidation, discrimination and harassment, and as well another body of work in collaboration with the Prime Minister's and Cabinet, the National Office of Child Protection, to look across all sports capability to audit it around child protection policies and deliver education awareness programs right across all aspects of sport. In our first 12 months of operations, we've had over 700 matters come to us, which I think is quite significant, because what that tells me is there is a level of trust. We are onto something. We've got a long way to go. We're learning a lot as we go and adapting as we go. But when you have 700 matters coming to the organisation, which range from breaches of child safeguarding, member protection policies, drugs, match fixing, global match fixing rings, but serious criminality around behaviours around children, it tells me there's certainly a need for our organisation. And I'll go a lot more into that as we get through the presentations. So that's just a bit of an overview of the short 12 months we've had and where we've evolved to.
Thank you. Thanks so much, David. It certainly is an important organisation, and just in that little life that you have had so far, already seeing some very clear evidence of the good that can happen. We have Tanya Hosh going to be talking, but she will be videotaped or beaming in through a pre-record. Tanya's going to discuss her experience and the work currently undertaken by the AFL to deal with gendered violence. I know that the team is working behind the scenes, so over to you, Ash and Taryn.
Hi, I'm Tanya Hosh, Executive General Manager, Inclusion and Social Policy at the AFL. I'm really sorry that I'm not with you in real time as originally planned for this important Full Stop Australia event today, but due to calls as a mum and me needing to attend something really important with my daughter at school. Look, thank you for the invitation. I want to acknowledge that I'm coming in from the land of the Kaurna people, which is the Adelaide Plains in South Australia, where I live. I feel really fortunate to be able to speak into issues around gendered violence and issues of equity for women from the perspective of the Australian Football League. Obviously, it's an organisation and Australian institution that has enormous reach, and so many people not just follow our game, but increasingly follow our example, or at least pay attention to our example. So it is critical that a sport that has been a professional sport primarily for men up until 5 years ago, it is a sport steeped in tradition, and one that has obviously been governed by men primarily as well. Now, all of that is changing. And it was changing before AFLW came to be, and a lot of people don't realise that we had women playing football across the country for over 100 years before AFLW started. And I think if you've ever been to a local footy game in particular, you'll be well aware of the important role that a lot of women play in the sporting landscape. And you know, it's not all about on-field participation. Women are everywhere. We're more than half the world. And so making sure that sport that is inherently a social activity can meet the needs of all of us in the community and be a place where we can all participate safely and confidently is critical. And when you have the numbers of eyeballs on your sport like we do, that's an enormous privilege, but with that privilege comes a lot of responsibility. When I was appointed to the AFL Executive in August 2016, I was the second woman and first Indigenous person ever to be appointed to the AFL Executive. And I have to say, I didn't really understand the enormity of that and what it signified and what it meant. 5 seasons on, I've got a much greater appreciation for the significance of it. But one of the things that I would share is that I've been enormously challenged, but also found a lot of opportunity. When I first started working at the AFL, there were so many women working in football across the country who reached out to me to let me know that they were there. And so there's a couple of things that I can speak to around what the AFL is doing. One of the first things that I had to do when I arrived in 2016 was provide a review and update of our respect and responsibility policy, which had primarily been in place in relation to dealing with breaches of the code in relation to assault or harassment of women. Kate Jenkins, the Federal Sex Discrimination Commissioner, had agreed to chair the review committee, so we were very fortunate with the expertise of herself, Ken Lay, Mary Barry, who was CEO of Our Watch at that time, and my dear friend, Professor Larissa Berent. They oversaw some great work that really did dig deep across our system in relation to the experiences and the way that people thought about and what their beliefs were about these incidents where women would find themselves harassed or assaulted by an official or a player of our game. We now have a much stronger policy. It's been in operation for almost 4 years now. It is a victim-centric policy now, and the feedback that we're getting from victims and complainants is so positive, unsolicited, but frequent. Women feel much more supported by our systems. We have a caseworker who is outsourced, so they are not an employee of the AFL, who is the first person that a victim or complainant will speak to. They can make a complaint online, so they don't actually have to pick up the phone. And now clubs know that if someone comes to them because it concerns a player or official from their club, that they must refer it directly to the AFL. The results that we're getting also have been enhanced by the fact that there's now an annual report to the AFL Commission, which is our board of governance, to look at the number of complaints, the nature of them. They're all unidentified, of course, and confidentiality is maintained for all parties, but at least they know how many complaints are coming. This does also include complaints from our community football, not just at the elite level. What that also does, it allows us to have a look at our policy. So we're not waiting for another major incident that hits the media before we're reviewing our policy again. It is an annual process based on the feedback of all parties to complaints through the process across a year, and we're taking into account all of that input, as well as our investigation team, which is the integrity department. We're very fortunate that there's a number of the staff there, particularly women, who are former police officers who specialised in sexual assault. In particular, it's important to point out too that our respect and responsibility policy is also gender neutral, so it can deal with complaints regardless of the sexuality of the people involved. That is also important because we do have a game that is played on binary grounds, a women's game and a men's game. In addition to that, obviously prevention is important. We know that policies don't drive behaviour, but people's beliefs do. And so while all our players and staff are very clear on their responsibilities under this policy, we're also going through the process of training every club and also AFL, which is a separate organisation from the clubs, and all 18 clubs are both the staff and players of both the men's and women's games in respectful relationships training. We're rolling that out on a trial internally at the moment, and we'll be delivering that to all the clubs, club by club, in the new year. It's really important from the perspective of confidentiality and other considerations that we do that club by club so that they do have that sense of security. Our clubs do compete on everything that they do, and so these sorts of conversations, it's important that they're done in a way that gives that that ability for people to speak in really open terms. We're having these conversations at the AFL all the time. We know that critical mass is important too. It's really pleasing that the last 3 premierships have been clubs that have been led by women, where, you know, when I first started at the AFL, there was only 1 woman president of a football club, and there's now 3, which is great. We're seeing an increase of women on the boards of clubs as well. And I think what that does is makes it very clear, as well as obviously clubs now being a shared space with women, and by 2023 all 18 clubs will have a women's team. So this is rapid change for an organisation and a system that's been around for as long as ours, and it is one that is really prospering as a result of women's inclusion. But it also means that we've got to be a lot more cognizant and proactive about ensuring that we're doing everything we need to do so that we can all be our best in this system, all be confident to be who we are. That's what real inclusion is. It's not all trying to adapt to a dominant feature of a dominant culture. It's about us all being able to be ourselves. It's a real honour to be in a position to be having some of these conversations, and sometimes they're difficult conversations to have, but they're important. You can't deal with problems that you're not talking about, and I can assure you that these are conversations that are live and active in the Australian Football League across the 18 clubs. We've still got a lot of work to do, but the conversations are being had. They're being had on a regular basis, and we're listening to the women in our system, we're listening to the men in our system, and we realise that the best way to address all of these issues is for us to work together. Thanks.
Oh, and thanks so much to Tanya for taking the time out of her schedule and really sharing with us the I guess the advancements and the strategies that AFL has put in. That's fantastic. The next person that is going to share her views around the work that she has been involved in and her own reflections, and also the role she's played in establishing athletes' rights, is Min Coons. Hello, Min, welcome. Min, if you don't know, is an Australian Olympian and former elite athlete in 2 sports, not one. One wasn't enough: artistic gymnastics and freestyle aerial skiing, not skilling, although you'd have to be skilled to do skiing. Her career is spanned across 13 years, but it's her work out of the sport, or sort of not competing, that she'll be sharing today. Hello, Min.
Hello. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really nervous. This is the first time I've done this, so I apologise if I fumble. Yeah, so I guess I'm the athlete on this panel. I definitely don't come from a place of sports admin or governance or policy. That's not what I can really bring to the table today, but I hope that really I'm here to help amplify the athlete voice. This year I co-founded Athlete Rights Australia, which is a athlete-led not-for-profit with a mission to bring about positive change in Australian sport by creating safe, fair and inclusive sporting environments, from grassroots right through to elite. Our belief is that for too long, the athlete voice has really been suppressed, ignored, silenced, and that results can often be given more importance than the mental and physical well-being of the athletes themselves. So ultimately, this was really about ending systemic abuse and violence, bullying, intimidation, all of the above that exists across the Australian sporting landscape. It's probably worth, if I take a teeny step back, and then it'll make sense in a second, just telling a little story. So I've been out of sport for a really long time, and just following a professional career in something completely different. How I've ended up here today is, as David spoke about, gymnastics has kind of gone through a reckoning of late, and that was not missed in Australia as well. Having been an elite gymnast in Australia, I've obviously got a role to play in this overall conversation. But when that Australian Human Rights Commission report came out, having been a part of gym during that era, it was really important for me to read and digest what was in it. So I really did devour that report from start to finish. And the outcome of that for me was really, I wept the whole way through. It was very confronting. And it was probably the turning point for me stepping into this space, in that for the first time, there was a language around what I had suffered, what my experiences were in the sport. I actually had a terminology and a language that I could attach to those memories. Previous to that, I just didn't have it. So I guess why I'm bringing that up now is it's really important as we move forward through this, is that we need to build a common language for athletes around this in this context of sport. That is such an important part of what needs to be done. It can't be the academic language and it can't be the law language, because it kind of doesn't land with the people who are participating. They have the volume, the participants. And so I urge everyone in this conversation, that language for everyday athletes at all levels, from kids right through to adults. In order for us to have the right conversations, we need a common language to be able to have the conversations and to talk about what's happened in order to fix it. And then separately, how to empower athletes to advocate for themselves. So that's my long-winded way of saying that's what athlete rights is about. It's about sort of, amplifying the athlete voice, and there's many ways to do that. We're still figuring that bit out.
Thanks so much, Min. If you were nervous, I don't think we could tell, but we certainly understand that you would be. And I think that we really want to come back to you about that common language, and how we actually get to do that. But before we do, I really want to introduce us all to Adair Donaldson. Adair, if you don't know him, is Director of Donaldson Law, but he certainly has had a long history in supporting people who have experienced violence, particularly survivors of abuse in institutions. He sits on the Respectful Relationships Committee for the NRL and has had loads of hats, and he is a good friend of Full Stop Australia, and someone whose opinion we certainly value. Hello, Adair, and thanks for joining us.
Hi, again, thank you so much for those kind words. So I'm coming to you from up in Toowoomba on the Chagara, Jibal and Jarraway land. So proud to be here. And so proud to be associated with Full Stop Australia. I'm also pretty humbled to be on a panel with Min. Davo, Min is somewhat of an absolute legend. And the reason I say that is that when we deal with athletes that have been exposed to gender violence, abuse and harassment in sport, I come at it from two lenses, and one is looking after athletes that have been subjected to abuse during their sporting careers. So that's one lens. And the other lens that I assist with is working with sporting institutions and athletes who are exposed and could possibly be at risk of committing acts of gender violence, whether it be harassment, DV, sexual assault, breaches of code of conduct. But if I can come back to that first element to start with there, and that's about athletes that have been exposed to abuse during their chosen careers. And once again, I don't think it'll come as a surprise to anybody that the reason why we're talking about these issues is because there was this incredible group of elite athletes, these women that came forward, and Min led the charge together with Alison and Sophie, Vivian and others. And they saw what was happening overseas, and they came back and they said, hey, listen, we can bring about change here. And it was through their advocacy that's where the Human Rights Commission became involved, and that's because, and I've got no doubt that the reason why we're getting change in Gymnastics Australia has largely been as a result of these incredible women. Now, what we're talking about here is with the gender violence, etc., it shouldn't come as a surprise to anybody, because in 2012, when the Royal Commission came out and they made their findings with respect to institutional child abuse, and they did a case study with respect to looking at sports. And for some of the common themes that resonated there were issues with respect to unchecked and unaccountable leaders and poor leadership, that pursuit of excellence at any cost, the protection of reputation as a primary concern. And then in addition to that, they had these institutional cultures of physical abuse and bullying that were occurring in the institutions. And again, that shouldn't have come as any surprise, but 2012, sporting bodies cannot say that they have not been put on notice that these issues should be front and centre, and that they should be addressing particularly the violence towards women. And they did make recommendations as to what should occur. And effectively, the Royal Commission said that there should be better reporting. There should be, and that's independent reporting, and that's where David and his team, Sport Integrity Australia, come to the fore. There needs to be better training so people are actually aware of what that process is. And then most importantly is that we should be providing better support to our athletes and our, particularly the likes of Min and her cohort, and that because they've as children and young girls, they were exposed to the most horrendous abuse at this pursuit of winning at any cost. And I believe that as a nation, we should be looking after them, we should be doing more for them. So that's on that side of it, where we're looking after the athletes. But again, if we then go to having a look at institutions, and we work with a number of sporting institutions, and I suppose the highest profile one there is with respect to the NRL. Now, some of you listeners are going to be thinking, geez, you're not doing such a good job, particularly with the NRL, but I'd be saying this to you, is that I can put my hand on my heart and say that as an employer, the NRL is second to none when it comes to the training, when it comes to the primary, the secondary and the tertiary prevention with respect to their athletes, and that's at all levels. So if you start at the primary level with respect to how we're going to go about addressing the educating athletes, it's got to start young. It's got to start, and I know that the chance of a NRL player, of a player making it to the elite level, I think is less than, and Dave will probably correct me here, but I think it's less than 1% that any players are going to actually make it to that level. But from the NRL's perspective, what they're doing is they're getting out early and they're starting to educate players and trying to change those attitudes before they actually get into the system. And when we look at those programs, they're dynamic programs. They're looking at the ethical issues, they're looking at the cultural issues, and they're looking at the legal issues. And that's my lane where I come in to provide support. But any training that we must do, and this is the same thing in the broader society, any training that we must do, whilst we're starting at the bottom, we've also got to work top down as well. And that means that there's people that are within government positions, not government, but in positions that are control and management positions there. And those people certainly need to get up to speed in relation to the issues that are facing athletes, and particularly in relation to what more can be done to be addressing gender violence. In relation to the secondary prevention, and this is something that I'm incredibly proud with the NRL, is that there's a lot of secondary prevention available there. So that you've got to appreciate that the sport is an incredibly violent sport. It is and also it's an aggressive sport as well. But that is no excuse for violence towards women. And if anybody is even showing that they've got a tendency towards violence, and if it can be identified, getting them off to a secondary prevention and getting them involved in behaviour change programs and counselling that they need. And obviously where you don't want it to end up is in the tertiary prevention there. And obviously you've got the police prosecution, etc. But I don't think again, so far as an employer is concerned, with their no-fault stand-down policies with respect to domestic violence, if someone is charged in relation to serious offences, particularly against women, then there will be immediate consequences for those involved, and they won't be playing the game. So that's where I come from.
Thanks so much, Adair. I think that's a snippet of where you come from, and I think the primary, secondary and tertiary model is a really good way to break down the efforts of the NRL. There's a number of questions that are coming through from the audience, and we're going to try and address those in a moment. But we're really trying to understand why violence and inequality is happening. And only when we can understand it can we, of course, begin to make it stop. So can I ask you, in your opinions, and I'm going to go to David first, David, if that's okay with you, and then Min, I'm going to come to you in a moment to talk about this language, this common language. But David, what's the why? What's your snapshot of why inequality is happening and why it's leading to violence?
Yeah, thanks for that question. Well, can I declare up front, when we're talking about gender violence, I grew up in a household subject to significant gender violence and domestic violence, and if it was only my mother who survived that, was able to get me to training and sports and all those events as to why I'm where I am. So I have a very much a vested interest in where we are today. I think gender violence, there is no place for gender violence in sport. There's no place for gender violence and abuse anywhere. I think the conversation is turning very much due to brave people like Min, who you spoke exceptionally well and didn't at all, didn't take my eyes off you while you were speaking. So I think the more we hear from people like Min is really important. I think diversity of voice is critical. Diversity of voice from everyone is critical to addressing these issues. But I think what's really important is we're having these conversations now. We're having these conversations which is highlighting the issues that we're seeing. And I mentioned before, a little bit off track, but I mentioned before we've had 700 matters come to us, and I see that as a good thing. That tells me people have the confidence to come forward and talk more than they ever have. And I think that's what's critical. But I think it's also critical to understand we all own this. It's not for me to solve this problem, but it's for me to listen and for me to learn, and me then to bring the collective agency, skill sets in this agency, resources of government together to address this issue across sport. As someone said the other day, our central focus is on education, which we've just been talking about, and do a lot with Adair actually, and some of his exceptional programs, and it's got to go to grassroots. We've got to start the conversation there. But as someone said, with everyone we've brought to the table, with secondments from human rights and AFP and the like, we have access to 60,000 police in this country from our model that we've built now. We have welfare services such as Full Stop, who are helping our staff and helping people that come to us, not just athletes who are victims, but we also are working with athletes who have been sanctioned now and providing welfare, which is critical to the discussion.
Thanks, David. I mean, I think the question was a really broad question. Why? And I think you've begun to unpack it. Min was very passionate. Min, I'm going to come to you. You were very passionate when you talked about, look, we've got to stop talking this complicated language and build a language that's accessible and is meaningful to athletes. Can you tell us a little bit more about what you mean by that?
Yeah, I mean, I can only talk to my experiences in sport, which I think is the right way to go. I'm not going to talk to someone else's. But coming from a sport like gymnastics, that very young, so I had all but retired from my career in gymnastics by 16, which is highly unusual in the grander scheme of things, but it's a really unique environment, but not necessarily. I mean, all sports have elite programs that push you into these sort of very win at all costs kind of environments. So I'm talking about, I think a really big part of this is the power imbalances that are kind of in sporting environments, particularly where there's children involved. I know in gymnastics, those environments are extremely controlled. And so the athletes really have no power over the coaches, the administrators, the support staff, and even the parents really lose all their power as well, which I know is something it's not spoken about a whole lot, but it's been an interesting dynamic to kind of unpack over the years and see that shift. So I think in controlled environments like that, you don't have the maturity or the information to be able to sort of understand what's happening. I was way too young, I just didn't get it. You have feelings that things might be off, but you don't have anything to contextualize it against. And so how do we expect people like that to then report issues when they don't know what's actually the issue? So I think there's this sort of, I think we do need to do all the frameworks. We need all of these, we need ways for people to complain, and we need them to be independent and fair, and they need to be trauma-led, and that side of it, and what Sports Integrity Australia are doing is brilliant and we need it. But for me, there's this whole like precursor to that I truly believe that we're only touching the iceberg at the moment around what you're actually going to see as historic abuse, bullying, neglect, all of these sort of topics, because the language is missing. We don't have terminology, and it's really specific to sport. What happens in gymnastics is quite different than what happens in athletics, than what happens in football, the types of environments you're in, and it needs to be contextualized to be able to be useful conversation for us to change behavior. This is all about changing behavior and unlearning bad things and learning new things and then implementing that change. So I don't know if that answered your question. I feel like
it certainly has. No, it certainly has begun to unpack the question. I think it's complex, but I'm also hearing from you that because the sporting codes are different, and what happens in gymnastic might be different to what happens in basketball, for example. There's no doubt we need to better engage athletes themselves to start teaching us their language, the language that they want to use, when this kind of violence occurs in those different contexts. So I certainly heard from you, speaking directly to athletes, and certainly your organisation is trying to get that athlete's voice. Yeah. We also talked a little bit, and there's some questions coming through, and Adair, particularly I'm going to ask you to turn your mind to that. You talked about the Royal Commission that said, we need better reporting, we need better training, we need better support. But of course, we also need better prevention so we can avoid these things happening. And there's a person online who said we've seen mass harassment of female players at sporting events, which can quickly turn violent and are traumatising for the victim and survivor spectators. What can we, or what are we doing to address this on the spot before it happens or when it escalates? And that's really a prevention question. Just wondering, Adair, if you've got a thought around that.
Well, there's a couple of things there. First of all, I think that we have, as a society, we have doing pretty well when something does occur, that we are calling it out publicly, and again, that's vital. That when something is occurring and that it's not right, or harassment, etc., is being called out and it's being dealt with. But as we know, behavioural change or systemic change is going to take a long time. Now, you would like to think that with coaches and with administrators, etc., that they're going to implement strategies because they want to do it for altruistic reasons, you know, for the benefit of society, etc. But if they're not going to do it for altruistic reasons, then they should be doing it for monetary reasons. And the reason for this is that if an incident occurs which brings the game into disrepute and is against violence against women, for instance, or harassment, etc., and it's not in line with community standards, then the people and sponsors are going to vote with their feet, and that's where the clubs are sitting up and taking notice, because they now know if they aren't addressing these issues, then financially it is going to impact on them. So again, we would love them to be doing it. We'd love them, to do it for altruistic reasons, and I believe that's what the majority of clubs are doing, or the sports. But if they're not going to do it for altruistic reasons, then they should be addressing it for financial reasons.
Yeah. Thanks, Adair. I think there's growing evidence and demand from public and supporters and funders that they won't tolerate behaviour that's violent, and they do want equality. So you're quite right. There's a real load of gains around that. There's a number of questions in the chat, and I'm going to go to you, David. And thanks so much from all of you who are listening in, sending in your questions. That really makes a conversation like this certainly much more effective. David, a question from Sophie Moore. Thanks, Sophie. Along the lines really of what Min was sharing with us regarding language of misconduct in sport. There's a question around Sport Integrity Australia's working on a safe sport code, putting a name to these activities. Sophie says it's similar to the US code and one in Singapore. Can you talk to that?
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity, Sophie. Absolutely, the language is critical. What we identified was that across sports you're having varying degrees of response, integrity capability, varying policies to deal with member and child protection. What we've developed in conjunction with sport and input from the AOC, the CGA and Paralympics Australia, we've developed the National Integrity Framework, which is a consistent suite of policies across sports to provide language that's consistent across all sports. Yes, every sport is different, I understand that, but this is a consistent framework. It's a consistent language which identifies what is prohibited conduct. It spells out abuse, bullying, harassment, sexual misconduct, unlawful discrimination, victimisation, vilification, and we could go on. But across these frameworks, it is consistent for all sport. Within that, we've gone one step further, and if the sports adopt this framework to make it consistent, we have what's called the independent complaints handling model, where independent complaints or complaints of this type of behaviour come to us to be managed independent of the sport. From that, we can investigate. From that, we can just listen to people who just want to tell their story, but outcomes of an investigation or outcomes of just listening can then inform how we roll out education programs at all levels of sport. It tells us, it gives us the data, the information of how and where we need to educate, what we need to educate, but it's got to start right at the first time someone starts sport. That's where we need to start the conversation. And then we need to also really target the top end of sport here. The CEOs, the boards, to understand this is a good thing. This National Integrity Framework, this consistent language to be adopted and a consistent approach across sport, which is independent, is needed.
Yeah.
Can I ask David a question about that?
Go for it.
Yeah, am I allowed?
Of course you're allowed.
Just a question on kind of the push-pull model, because at the moment it's sort of an opt-in to the National Integrity Framework situation. I know that's because we're still building the plane while we're flying it. I totally get that. But will there be a switch that we flip where this is a mandated process for all sports and all NSOs to sign up? They've kind of got a deadline.
Yeah, and that's a fantastic question. There's a couple of things in that to unpack. You could legislate this at the federal government level. You've then got issues around state governments and the like. But the minute you start to legislate and say, here's the powers, go investigate, I think we've lost the argument. I think what we've got to do is make sports come along, own responsibility for these issues. I'm seeing a wonderful turn from the sports that really do accept where we're going, what we're doing. But we've got to come along for the ride together. We've got to help sport build its education programs. We've got to help sport build its integrity capability, because, to be honest, we can't do everything. And so signing over the policy authorities to us for that independence is a wonderful thing. The next argument is sports that are government funded that don't buy into this, given government has listened to sport and said, yes, there needs independence, that we need this framework. Government is funding that for sport at no charge to sport, which is quite incredible. That's the shift and the listening to the athlete and the voice of athletes. So it's there now that sports either really get on board in partnership, we help build their capability, we deliver the other end, the top end of town. But the next conversation will be government funded sports will be expected. And a lot of sports rely on government funding, the majority do. The next conversation would be legislation. I don't think we need to get there. I think the tide has turned, long way to go, but you now have the start of the conversation. You now have a mechanism through Sport Integrity Australia to hold people to account. And you're probably aware, Min, as others are, that I'm not scared of calling out behaviours of Russia, of the lack of female leadership in sport, of the lack of independence, and certainly I'll continue to do that whenever I've got a job.
Yeah, thanks, David. And Min, I think, again, very good question, and people in the chat are applauding that question and that answer for sure. But what we're also seeing in the chat is some conversation around behavioural change. And Adair, I'm going to come to you in a tick. Rebecca has asked a question, or really made a statement, that behavioural change is very hard to do. Where do we target this change? As she believes athletes are more aware now of what's right and what's wrong. Voicing concern is another matter. However, how do you really get behavioural change right across the sector and right across sporting at a coaching level, administrator level, organisational level? And there are ways that things are just done for outcomes, so that they're not just, so they're actually driven by outcomes and that change. And I think one of the things I've heard you speak a lot about, Adair, is the importance of role modelling as a tool, as an effective strategy to affect that behavioural change.
Well, just on that, to start with respect to that, what can be done. I spoke earlier about a bottom-up approach and a top-down approach. And a recent example of that is a project with the NRL, where it's current issues that are affecting athletes, so whether it be in relation to racial abuse, whether it be issues with regard to consent, and whether it be in relation to fear and shame coaching models. And so the way that we approached it there was two different models, one to be aiming at the athletes and then the other one to be aiming at the coaches, so that there can be, again, we never want anybody to say that I didn't know what I'd signed up to. I didn't know what the code of conduct or what contract I was signed up to. Education is a big start there. And so a lot can be done in that space. And just last week, the Gold Coast Titans brought together a group of 300 young athletes and their parents. And these young athletes range between 16 to 18 years of age. and it was a condition that they participated in training and engaging training on this subject material before they got to play. Now, to actually get parents into a room to address these issues, that's rare. And I work with a lot of schools, to be able, and yet we'll get parents turning up if they think that it's going to be in their best interest of their children. So that's what can be done. You spoke about role models. I've got a bit of an issue with respect to role models. To start with, I think that one of the greatest role models we've got in Australia at the moment is an athlete. They epitomise everything that is good about sport. And of course, that's Ash Barty, and she is incredible. So she is an absolute wonderful role model. If we're going to talk about footballers being role models, that's when I start to be a bit challenged by that, because a lot of these young men, they're going to come from challenging backgrounds themselves. They're growing up in the public eye. It's 18, 19, 20 years of age type thing. And we know that young people make poor decisions. So I've got a problem with using players as role models. They are good athletes. It doesn't mean that they're good men.
Thanks, Adair. Thank you. There's a couple of other questions in the chat. Thank you, Rachel and Natali, when will sporting codes begin to include lived expertise in the training and education programs they provide? And I think, Min, you might have something to say about that.
Oh, I don't.
Or maybe,
sorry.
I just assumed. So do you think people with lived experience?
I mean, I believe it to be true. We should definitely be doing that. I think if that's the question, it should be happening now. Absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you, Min. Thank you. Just before you do that, sorry, Adair, and I think
I was going to help Min out with that question, because if she can talk about the work that athletes' rights are doing, because one of the things that they're doing is talking about their lived experience. And that's where it's bringing about change. So I was going to just prompt Min with just talking about how her, what she went through can bring about change for future athletes.
Yeah, I mean, the backbone of me even being involved is in any of this is that I just don't want people to go through what I went through. Like that's the backbone of everything. And I see that through telling stories. Like that we can only be told through the lives of people who have been through it and can kind of explain how that's impacted them, and then we can work to try and fix it. I think you can't have this coming from people who don't understand the issues intimately and have been at the receiving end of it, to be honest with you. So our whole cohort, who I founded Athlete Rights Australia with, we're all survivors of different types, different severities, different timeframes. It's all over the place. And I think that's a real reflection of sort of where we're at in society, in sporting landscape. And I think everybody, if I could reflect on when I talk to athletes about this stuff, everyone assumes that someone else's story is way worse than theirs. It's just kind of how people show up to the conversation going, mine wasn't so bad, but here's what happened to me. And when they tell you what happened, you're like, wow, like you think that you minimized that whole story, and actually that's really critical in us having a proper conversation around it so that we can fix the problem. So I think it's critical that we have lived experience as a forefront of these conversations. They're going to be hard conversations too. Like hearing this stuff is not pleasant, but it's also a reflection of like this history that we have needs to be used to fix the problem and make sure it doesn't continue to happen in the future. And we need our athletes to step forward in forums like this where we can talk about it and then help the organisations that are there to help athletes and to drive sport more broadly. I think it's critical. Empower the athletes.
Thanks so much, Mina, and thanks, Adair, for reframing that question. It really goes to the initial thing around language. You've got Rachel, who is totally agreeing with you in terms of that response, and I think you'll get not not many people or any people disagreeing with you about the importance of having people who are absolutely have that lived experience to really drive the change. Again, there is a number of comments in there. Couldn't agree more. The behavioural change question is there. David, there is a question here for you if we can turn our mind to this. And it's really in developing the NIF, who were the athlete cohorts involved in shaping that? And if you can have just a couple of seconds around that, that would be great. That's from Alison Quigley. Who was involved? Yep.
Sorry, there are a number of people. I'm trying to get this into seconds. It's going to be difficult, but a number of people shaped the National Integrity Framework. It's been developed over the course of the last 2 years. It was actually being developed in the lead up by Sport Australia, in the lead up to Sport Integrity Australia becoming involved. I can provide all that, but there were numerous bodies engaged in the development of that, sports and athletes, as well as we have an athlete advisory group at Sport Integrity Australia who have been formed along the way. Not only that, we've had Commonwealth Games Association, AOC and Paralympics representing as well. So look, it's numerous. There's a long list I could provide, but certainly it has been informed by many people, including athletes, and we are very big on supporting and driving athletes' rights. So, but we now have a new group that we can also work with, which is fantastic.
Yeah. Thanks again, David. Thanks so much for that response too. There is just so much work that is being done, but obviously more work that is needed. We've nearly reached that 5 o'clock mark, how quickly 1 hour goes when you're having good conversation. I'm going to ask you all a question to sum up very, very quickly, 30 seconds if you can. What are you going to be working on for the next 3 to 6 months? What's your priority to really bring gender equity in sport and to really, end violence? What are you going to be working on? What is your priority? I'm going to go to you, Adair.
We're on two fronts. One, we're assisting individual athletes who've survived abuse, so we'll continue to do that. But on the education front, we've got a new resource that is addressing a number of the issues that we've discussed today, and that's just going to be rolled out throughout all levels of rugby league, and then be dealing with other sports as well. So, the issues that we're talking about are issues that are affecting the whole of society. Issues, most current one obviously is affirmative consent. Getting education out there, and really good education in relation to understanding the changes to the law.
Terrific. Thanks so much, Adair. And David, what's your priorities? 3 to 6 months.
Lead from the front. Continue to progress our gender balance in the organisation so we can lead. We're now at nearly 60% of our staff are female, 78% of our non-ongoing staff are female, 50% of our executive are female. So lead from the front in changing the conversation. And secondly, ensure that sports adopt the National Integrity Framework, consistent policies, consistent language, but we help sports do that. We help them build the capability to be able to provide a response that is being called for all over the world.
Terrific. That's fantastic. And Min, what are your priorities? 3 to 6 months. What are you going to be working on?
Yeah, we are a very new organisation and we are definitely still figuring out where we're headed. We've definitely got 3 core pillars, which full stop will be completely across being education, advocacy and support. And that is all about our members, which are our athletes. And in each of those pillars, we're definitely going to be attacking it on all fronts. I think what that is exactly, we are still to figure out. So keep an eye out for our posts.
Thank you, Min. Yeah, that sounds like a busy 6 months for everyone. To everyone who's joined in this afternoon, thank you so much. Thank you for engaging in the chat.
Marika, could I just finish just by thanking, I've been involved with Full Stop since 2007. The role that you play is just remarkable, And it's just, I thank you so much for the giving us the opportunity today, but I thank you for everything you do each day, every day.
That's very nice. Thank you. And
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Genuine thanks for acknowledging that. And, you know, this is why we exist as an organisation, and this is why we try and create platforms to bring people together to have these kinds of conversations. There is more to do. Thank you to everyone who's joined us this afternoon. Thank you for your questions. Apologies we didn't get to them. If any of the information, any of the conversation has triggered you or you feel that you need to reach out, 1-800-FULL-STOP. That's 1-800-FULL-STOP. Thank you all again. We hope to see you at the next event and hope that our paths cross in the work that we do. Have a good night, and thank you very much to the panellists. Big clap to everyone. So thank you. Good night, everyone.